Hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this episode, hold on to your horses because I am going to do something unprecedented. I am going to talk not about fooding white tea and talk a little more about the nature of tea in the Chinese world and the Western world and kind of how we talk about it, the knowledges we portray, how much we believe we know about tea, how much we don't know about tea, and just this whole narrative that goes on, you know, in the internet forums, in the online world, and then even in the tea houses here in China when people are talking about the teas that they think they know about, and they give all these kinds of informations, but sometimes it's not always true. And while I initially wanted to talk a little more about fooding white tea, we can get back to that in the next episode. I want to break down all the different picking grades, the different styles of fooding white tea, but that can wait. In this episode, because I had something that happened to me recently, is somebody challenged my understanding of tea, and they were right. And I had to kind of go back and redact what I was saying, change what I was saying, and the ultimate result of that is that my knowledge of tea grew. And the only thing that suffered was my pride. And so in this episode, I'll take the dangerous perspective of looking into kind of some of the tea narratives out there, the internet forums, the Instagram world, the Reddits, the Discords, and then also talk about how people in China talk about tea and what happens to me when I hear somebody in China talking about tea that I know that's not true, but I just kind of politely hold my tongue because, you know, they're the master and I'm just a foreigner in their tea house. And this is, if you listen to last episode, 2 episodes ago, where they're talking about the fooding white tea, this aged brown Chomay, and it just tastes terrible. And I can tell something horrible went wrong in the processing or the storing or the aging, but everyone's talking about how good it is because it costs this much money. So everyone has a very different objective of what they want to get out of tea, right? It's a very nerdy niche, and a lot of people really love that, where it's something, a world you can delve into and you can kind of gain your knowledge, you can study everything, and really one lifetime is not enough to know everything about tea, and no one knows everything about tea. And so the difference here is that you get people that believe they know everything and the people that don't believe they know everything. And, you know, even though I have been buying and selling tea for the past 10 years, I've been living in China for the past 7, I've been going to all the tea mountains I can, meeting with all the producers, checking out their gardens, observing their whole processings and whatnot, there are still a lot of things that I do not know about. You know, I'm not a master, but I did start this podcast, and like, what I want to do here is say, and I think I said this maybe in the second episode, where, you know, I'm not a biologist. I don't know everything that's happening in these plants and in these leaves, and so I am fallible. And so if you're listening to this, you know, don't take my word as law, but take it as like a jumping off point for understanding tea and tea culture. What I'm doing is I'm kind of trying to establish a foundation that, you know, other people can talk about, build off of, you know, challenge if they need to, and we can all grow in our understanding of tea. And so a little bit about me, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I really don't like to do things halfway. I like to make sure I have everything set in stone before I act. And so for me, this podcast is a little premature. But at the same time, instead of putting it off my entire life until I know 100% of everything about tea and everything I'm going to talk about, I'm going for it because that's how you grow. That's how you learn. And so I'm actively putting myself outside of my comfort zone. I'm actively seeking out this growth experience, this potential to speak on something I know a little bit about and to learn a whole lot more because, let's be honest, in every episode, I'm doing a lot of research and I'm learning so much about tea. You know, I started out knowing 20% and now I'm, you know, up a few more percentages. And this is something that's been essentially haunting us the whole time we've been doing One River Tea, because if you've been following us, we're very into transparency. We're very into explaining everything we can about the tea, the garden, the producer, the processing and whatnot. But it turns out some of those things are false. Some of the things we thought were happening actually aren't happening. And so what's required of us is a little bit of humility, or quite a bit of humility, where we can go back and say, we were wrong about this. We apologize. I'm sorry. This is actually what is happening going forward. Now everyone can be aware of that. And this is how you can not only grow by yourself, but also kind of help everyone else on that journey of knowledge, of learning, of growth. And I have a few examples of how this happened to us and how we've had to go back on the teas that we're selling and kind of explain what was happening there. So one of them was from Tao Shu Bao, this really nice collective, partially collectivized cooperative in Enshire. And we found they were made this really nice gold bud black tea, this Jinjun Mei, and we really loved it. We sold it all of 2020. We were selling it in 2021. This farm was also part of the Solidarity Trust initiative that we did, which was kind of a challenge on the idea of fair trade, because what is exactly fair trade if we're buying it from this independent market and economic milieu and then selling it into one where we can, make so much more money from it? And so what we did is we had an initiative with these farms where we give 50% of the proceeds back to the farm. And so they were kind of our partner farms, and they get 50% of everything we make out of their tea. And this farm was part of it because we really liked what they were doing. And then we found out that the gold bud black tea they were selling us, this Jinjun Mei, they didn't grow it. It came from Sichuan. And we found another person who says, yeah, I sell them this tea and I buy it from Sichuan. And we were just like, whoops. And so there goes all of our real nice transparency of yeah, we know the farms, we know the farmers, we've seen the plants, and yeah, we can see some plants. We know the farmers, they can tell us these are the plants, but at the end of the day, we were lied to, and we passed that lie on to the customers. And so then we did a blog post about it. We kind of mentioned it. We took it off the website, but it kind of felt like, okay, we've done something bad and it wasn't our fault, but now we have to own up to it. Now we have to talk about it. Now we have to really show people what's going on. And I have a few more examples of, how this happened, not from somebody lying to us, but from us having the wrong idea. And so this one is from the notorious Chao Qing. Chao Qing was a green tea I first found in Anhui. And I was like, wow, Chao Qing, okay, in Anhui they make Chao Qing. There's a very cool wok-made green tea. And then I go to Suzhou and they're like, oh, we make this Chao Qing. Chao Qing is the lower grade of Bilochun. And I'm like, okay, so they're making Chao Qing in Anhui, which is a lower grade of Bilochun from Suzhou. And I'm like, that's very interesting. And then I go to the Phoenix Village, and they're making this green Dansong oolong, and they're calling it Chao Qing. And I'm like, hold up. What is happening? And then I realized, after writing a blog about Chao Qing when I first found it out, after selling it on the website, I found out Chao Qing is just the really ultimately general term used for any type of green tea that's made in a wok. And so the higher qualities of Bilochun would be called Bilochun, but then anything that doesn't quite meet that grade, they just call Chao Qing. Chao Qing literally just means it was the green was killed in the wok, it was dried in a wok, it was shaped in a wok, everything happens in a wok. So you could call so many types of green tea Chao Qing. And so this is something I kind of had to go back on, where it's okay, what I said earlier is not true. Now I know this. And you don't know what you don't know until you know it, which is, sounds really silly, but that's the ultimate truth of it. And so having a company, having a podcast that's so open and talking about tea, it does require a lot of editing, going back, redacting it, making corrections, and showing that you are fallible. Really, from starting out One River Tea, this was kind of the intention that we had, to show the complicated truth and not just give the simple lies. Because the simple lies are, okay, this is a tea that was made by a family farm. And then it's okay, getting more complicated. Family farm is a Chinese term for a jiating nongchang, which a jiating nongchang is any local business, any business that is registered within a single household, or like a head of a household can make this single company, and that's called a jiating nongchang, and then that suddenly becomes a family farm, even if it's not necessarily the family making it. Even if they're hiring out a bunch of labor, they're hiring out a person to make it, they're hiring pickers and everything. They could even hire a master to make the tea, but then it's still a jiating nongchang. It's still a family farm if it's sole ownership by a single family. And so there are many opportunities for misunderstanding, for propagating the wrong information when it comes to Chinese tea and sourcing tea in China. Additionally, the world of science hasn't quite caught up to the life in the mountains, the tea farmers that are making these teas. And so talking to the farmers, and a lot of my information comes directly from the farmers. It comes directly from my experiences on the mountains, and sometimes they'll tell me things that are wrong because they're using their traditional understanding of how to make tea, of how tea is made, and things like oxidization and fermentation. In Chinese, they're both called fa jiao, which is fermentation / oxidization. And so this is a term that applies to both. However, we know oxidization is very different from fermentation. One requires actual microbes enacting the change. The other is a chemical change that is inherent in the leaf itself. But the farmers will just use these interchangeably. I remember also in the Phoenix Mountains, one of my producers was talking about the kill green phase, the sha qing. And so he was doing the yao qing, which is the bruising of the leaves. And then he says, like, okay, now I'm going to sha qing it. And I'm like, okay. And I'm expecting him to get out his machinery for that. And then he just spins it through the tumbler again. And he says, okay, now it's been killed. And I'm like, that's not true, though. But this is just his use of the word. And so let me talk about the instance that kind of sparked this idea for the episode. I had a recent post on Instagram where I was using the term kill green in the wrong way. I was talking about white tea. I was talking about how white tea can be aged, and I used the term kill green when I should have been using sun dried or sun withering. And somebody commented very, very politely, and they were like, by the way, I don't think that sha qing happens in white tea production. There are only two main phases. There's withering, and then there's drying. And I thought about that, and instantly when I first read it, I felt this unconscious emotional reaction of being almost unfairly criticized or harshly judged. And I was like, wait, hang on, what's going on here? And I stopped. I thought about it for a long time because for me personally, I'm very aware of my emotions, my unconscious thoughts, my instant reactions to things, and I always unpack them. Because whenever I have an extreme reaction, there's something going on, maybe it's shadow work or something like that, where I'm always looking at, why did I react that way? Because that was not the right way to react, because I was wrong, they were right, and they politely corrected me. And after realizing what was happening, it kind of came down to pride. I wasn't feeling threatened. It was my pride was feeling threatened. My sense of mastery was being challenged. And as soon as I realized it was based on pride, then I was able to let go of all of the emotions, because pride is the greatest adversary towards self-growth. Because really what keeps you locked in your view of the world, what keeps you from growing is your sense of pride, is your sense of know-it-all, is this kind of idea that, I am right, I am the master. I've been doing this for so long, I don't need to learn anything because I already know everything. And if you think you already know everything, you're not going to grow. You're not going to change. You're not going to learn. And so when you're talking about anything, especially from trying to give somebody information, trying to educate people and share your own experiences, you're always kind of putting yourself out there to the potential of being wrong, to the possibility of being wrong. And that's not a problem if you're growth-oriented. It's only a problem if you're pride-centric and you kind of want to be that master and you don't want any challenges. But challenges are how you grow. And so on the road to mastery, pride is always the greatest adversary. And if somebody's correcting you, then that's the opportunity for everyone to learn. Not just you, not just them, but then everyone who's participating in the dialogue and listening to it, reading it, watching it, whatever. We're kind of all in this together. And if we can, politely correct each other and lead each other towards a greater enlightenment of the subject, then that's the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate ideal. And so, yeah, with my idea of being very perfectionistic, the idea of doing this podcast before I'm ready is kind of terrifying for me. But thank you all, by the way, so much for all the fantastic feedback, for listening to this every week, and really just expressing how grateful you are for it, because that really motivates me. That really keeps me confident with it, because it's just the way the human mind works, where you can get 100 glowing comments about how great something is, and then you get one bad feedback and you ruminate on the bad thing. So I really just can't express how grateful I am for all you wonderful listeners. So getting back into it, I want to talk about how this growth mindset, how this potential for fallibility works its way into how we organize ourselves as a tea company. Because instantly, I think if you really think about it, you can separate a lot of tea companies into a few different camps. Some tea companies are giving you all the information they can about the farm, where it was grown, the mountain, the name of the farmer, what he looks like, his favorite foods, and everything. And other vendors are giving you nothing. And why is this? And I think it really comes down to this idea of the more information you give, the more potential there is for some of it to be wrong. And so it's not like an easy way out saying nothing. It's more the fear that you're going to propagate something that's inaccurate. And there's already so many companies that are out there trying to give you as much information as they can. But we saw this in the tea industry when we looked at the brown Chomay. There are lies that start at the very root of this tree. The brown Chomay is being aged and something like that, and it just works its way right through. And so the more information you give, the more potential you are to be wrong, and the more you might have to walk stuff back. And if you've been in the tea world long enough, there are certain, scandals that happen about tea companies that say this thing that's wrong. And then everyone freaks out about it. It becomes a huge deal. And then everyone kind of looks at how the tea company will react. And, most of the time they don't say anything. They don't necessarily double down on it, but they just kind of ignore everyone who's talking against it. And this is making vast generalizations. I'm thinking of a few very specific instances where, somebody's selling tea that doesn't exist yet. And I'm actually seeing this happening right now, where a lot of people are talking about the teas are already being made. Right now it's, February 18th as I'm recording this. We're still 3 weeks out from any type of tea production in Jiangsu, in Fujian, in Zhejiang. But there are people online already selling spring 2023 green teas and white teas. And my initial thought is, wow, that's 3 or 4 weeks premature. Like, what are they doing selling this tea? It must be from last year. And then I'm realizing something that I found out from the Tao Shu Bao fiasco and other things that people are talking to me, like people that are selling tea, wholesalers and stuff like that. A lot of the tea production that's happening right now is already happening in Sichuan. And so a lot of these white teas, a lot of these really early green teas, they're all from Sichuan. And right now it's mid-February, and you can start making Silver Needle. You can start making Dragon Well. You can start making Bilo Chun. But if you remember last episode, we're still 3 weeks out from the legal start date to make Silver Needle in Fuding, March 5th. And so right now it's illegal to make Silver Needle or any type of white tea in Fuding. And so if you see any Silver Needle out now, hands down, 100%, it's not from Fuding, because that would be against the law. But again, as we said earlier, you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And I have sympathy for the vendors that, maybe are selling this, the people that are buying this, because they don't know. And our experiences with the Tao Shu Bao, with the Sichuan teas, that's our mistake. That's our ignorance. And yeah, we didn't know that these teas didn't come from Hubei. And so it happens. And so the result is, what you kind of have to get into is kind of break it down a little further. Who's doing it intentionally, and I hope no one is, and who's doing it willfully, ignorantly, which might be more, and then who's just totally oblivious to it. And I'm talking about, people buying it, people selling it, and really I don't want to demonize anything in this path of growth and this path of understanding, because it all comes down to communication, comes down to talking about what we know and piecing all our pieces together. And so what I do want to talk about is the other type of vendors, the ones who don't say anything about where their teas come from. They don't say anything about the farmers' names, the ethnic minority of them, because, and when I first started getting into tea, I was really worried about this because there is a certain level of appropriation that's coming with it, capitalizing on somebody else's culture, capitalizing on somebody else's labor. And, my partner Alex is a huge Marxist. And so he's really into, when we first started this, he says, what are we doing to add value to the teas that we're finding? How can we justify a 2x markup? What work exactly are we doing to justify doubling the price of labor, of picking this under the hot sun and processing it all day and growing it for 30 years? How can we justify, doubling that price just for ourselves? And so we kind of really get into this, and part of it is this kind of weaving through the story of it, trying to find what's going on and giving you guys all the information behind it. But other people, other vendors, they don't even do any of this, and that's totally okay as well, because their motive, their goal is something totally different. They don't want you to drink this tea because it comes from Farmer Zhang. They want you to drink this tea because you like drinking the tea. They want you to drink the tea because it's a good experience, not because it's Laoban or Laoban Zhang, but just because it's nice, good tea. So it's kind of the idea where if you say nothing, you can't say anything wrong. You can't say any lies. You can't really be challenged on that. But at the same time, we mentioned this, I think, in a few episodes ago, where what's the ultimate goal for drinking tea? Do you want a nice tea experience, or do you want to drink tea from Lion's Peak in Westlake, the Westlake area? And those are two different sensations. Some people want to believe that they're drinking Westlake, but they don't even really care if it is Westlake or not. And so this is, again, getting into that willful ignorance sometimes. And obviously, as One River Tea, what we're doing is we're trying to give you as much information as we can, as transparently as possible, and then having the courage and the humility to go back and correct ourselves when we're wrong. And so this is, our ultimate goal, our love letter to transparency, and this eternal quest to show the complicated truth of things. And we're not trying to tear apart other people's simplified lies. I think I was talking about the green versus brown shomei in a tea house to one of my tea friends in China, and she was like, you really shouldn't be telling people this because that hurts everyone in the industry. And I'm like, why does it hurt everyone in the industry? And she's like, well, now we can't sell fake white tea to foreigners. And I'm like, well, sure, but who's really going to be listening to this podcast? Who's really going to care? And like, I don't want to like be the bad guy for like all the people that are, trying to make a living or something off this. But I think it's worthwhile to share the truth when you come by it, and then share glimpses of the truth that you believe in. And here's a cool thing, what I just said there, glimpses of the truth, because nobody, as I said earlier, really understands the whole scope of Chinese tea and the Chinese market and the international market and the whole world. Nobody does. All we have are these small glimpses of our knowledges, and we're trying to piece them together into this patchwork framework of our own understanding. And there's a really, really beautiful Chinese idiom that is all about this that I want to kind of talk about now. And in Chinese, it's 盲人摸象, which means blind men feeling an elephant. And so what's great about the Chinese idioms is you can just say this in regular conversations in China and people understand. You're like, oh, it's just a blind people feeling an elephant situation. And to really understand that, you have to get into the story. And so let me tell you the story behind it. The story goes that there are a bunch of people with blindness who came to an emperor in ancient times. They said, we've never seen or felt an elephant, and we really want to understand what this majestic creature really is. And so, the emperor is like, okay. And so he takes out an elephant and lets this group of, 4, 5, 6 blind people feel the elephant and kind of get an understanding of what the elephant is. But they all go to different areas of the elephant and just feel that specific area. And so, one person touches the elephant's nose, the snout, the trunk. The other one touches the ears. Some touch the elephant's tusks or the teeth, and some touch the legs, and one even grabs the tail. And after some time has passed, the emperor comes back and says, okay, you guys have all felt the elephant and you know what it is. And they all say yes. He says, well, then tell me about it. And so the first one who touched the animal's leg says, wow, the elephant is just this really huge pillar. And then another one says, no, it's not. And then this is the guy who touched the elephant's nose, the trunk. He says, no, it's like a giant snake. And then the one who touched the ear interrupts and he goes, no, you guys are both wrong. It's very long, light, and slippery like a fan. And then the one who touched the elephant's body is like, obviously the elephant is thick, just like a huge wall. And the one who touched the tail says, you know, you guys are all wrong. The elephant is long and thin as a rope. And the emperor is so curious and he kindly says, you know, you guys are actually all wrong and yet you're arguing fanatically. You're dying on these hills about what's right, what's wrong, but you've all only felt a single piece of the truth. You guys don't have the whole picture. And so 盲人摸象 just means that you're drawing false conclusions from an incomplete set of data. And this happens so much in our lives. And you'll see this happening now that you kind of have this idea, this blind man feeling an elephant, you'll see that this happens so much in our own understanding of this world and, you know, the tea culture especially, where this happens even to me, where I see this X, Y, and Z and I assume the latter. And it's like maybe something that's happening in Chaozhou, and then I assume this is what's happening in the Wuishan Mountains, but it's inaccurate because I haven't been there seeing the charcoal roasting processing the same way I've been in Chaozhou. And so I really believe that it takes a great deal of humility to realize your own limitations, to realize that you don't know everything, even if you know a lot, and that anybody can still give you truth, can still give you a lesson. And so ultimately in this idea of having a growth-oriented mindset, why not be open to new stimulus? Why not be open to new ideas that could develop your own understanding of this world, this reality, and the things you love? And so it really only hurts yourself if you don't listen to other people when they correct you, when they give you criticism. But naturally, it's difficult, but you can usually kind of trace it back to pride. Another thing that is coming into my mind from this idea of the 盲人摸象 is, I think it's Ian McGilchrist's idea of the bicambrial mind, where you have the two hemispheres of the brain. And while they're not directly linked to one side being creative, one side being rational, they do perceive the world in a more rational way for the left hemisphere brain and a more complete way for the right hemisphere brain. And so this idea is kind of formulated in Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. And it kind of stems, as he says, from 20 years of deep research into this. And I saw one talk where he's talking about a lecture he saw before he got into this idea. That was somebody was looking at patients, stroke patients, with severe damage to a single hemisphere of the brain, where usually if it is the left hemisphere that's damaged, then the patients have difficulty communicating with speech, with writing, with a lot of these things, where if it's the right hemisphere of the brain, they have a difficult matter in perceiving reality and in reality making sense to them. And this is where you get a little bit of schizophrenia and you get the psychosis and people that are trying to piece together reality from an incomplete picture. And so essentially the left hemisphere of the brain is taking an incomplete image of the world and trying to fit that into a rational view of what's happening. And a lot of these ideas, they kind of have come in and out of vogue. In the 60s and 70s, there were kind of this neo-idea of, wow, there's one creative side of the brain and then one rational side of the brain. It's the Apollonian brain and the Dionysian brain, and they're ever at odds. But it's really like both hemispheres do both. And so it's not necessarily a direct dichotomy like that. However, it's really interesting to see this because we have the ability, if you look at beta waves and alpha waves in the brain and like the the ECGs, what are measuring your activity in your brain, you see the alpha waves and the beta waves. Alpha waves are usually associated with states of calmness, idle states, without really focusing on anything in particular, just kind of relaxing, while beta waves are more tied to problem solving, to thinking, but they're also tied to anxiety and they're tied to insomnia and stuff like that. And so a lot of people, this is getting into neurofeedback. I listened to this great podcast called Collective Insights, and there's one all about neurofeedback. And they talk about the ways to hook you up to a sensor where you can read your alpha waves and beta waves, and you can kind of train your brain to start stimulating more alpha waves for more relaxed state of mind, or more beta waves, which can give you that laser-like focus that a lot of people are really looking for. But getting back to Ian McGilchrist's idea on this, is he's not looking at precise functionality of the brains, but more on how they operate. And so one side of the brain, the right side of the brain, is primarily more focused on the general idea of what's happening around you, where the left hemisphere of the brain is more focused on finite details. And his example is looking at how a bird will pick up very specific twigs from the ground or food from the ground, while at the same time being aware of the environment around it. And so this is really important to having a split hemisphere of the brain, because you have to do both of these things simultaneously. You have to be ready for, a cat or something to approach, as you're very specifically figuring out how far away this little piece of food is from your beak. And so both these sides of the brains are responsible for kind of your attention, how you're perceiving the world. And he brings up an American neuroscientist called Elkanan Goldberg, who realized and found out with a lot of proof that a lot of new ideas, novel ideas, things that you've never thought about before, they all originate, their first land and make traction in the right hemisphere of the brain, and that general perception of the brain, of the world and everything. And then as they become processed and familiar, they migrate over to the left hemisphere of the brain. And so I guess what I'm getting here is this idea of how we acquire new information, how we learn new things, and this idea of neuroplasticity, because all forms of learning are a sense of neuroplasticity, where we have to have the mind malleable enough to take in new information, make new synaptic connections between our neurons, process it, and then put it into our realities, into that left brain that knows everything. And so from what I'm seeing here is the idea that a lot of new information enters through the right brain from our perception. If we're open to it, if we're reasonable to it, we can take it in and we can process it and we can put it into our greater whole. And so the idea here is that growth-oriented mindset, this neuroplasticity, the ability to perceive information that's outside of your view of the world, is essential for anyone really looking at growth. And to bring this back to tea, I get some of the most hard-nosed, closed-minded people here in China when I drink tea with them in their tea houses. I've never had a good experience bringing tea to a tea house in China, bringing any of my teas from anywhere to somebody who's making tea in, say, Chaozhou or in Jiangsu or in the Dragon Well village. They don't like any tea that's not their own. And maybe this is something like bringing your own food to a restaurant, and it's kind of taboo, but at the same time, in my mind, why shut down a new experience? But the whole manner of it is this: my tea rules, your tea sucks, like drink my tea. And I don't know if it's intentional or if it's based on, because in China you have this idea of mianzi, this sense of face, this respect. And so it's probably really not good to bring teas to somebody else's tea house if they're very specific on making and selling a certain type of tea. Though I also feel like it could be that they don't have the ability to appreciate teas outside of their realm of teas. And so if you look at tea processing, tea masters and tea makers, somebody who makes tea in Chaozhou, who makes the Dansong Oolong, doesn't know anything. And I'll just say that really probably doesn't know anything about making black tea unless they go to a region that makes black tea and they study it there. And so this is one of the really interesting things about looking at the history of tea, from the Ming Dynasty, where everyone's creating their different styles of this tea and that tea, and they kind of become secret formulas. And so you can't just go into any production household and say, hey, can you make this tea an oolong tea? Can you make this tea a red tea? Can you make this tea a black tea, a fermented tea? If they're not specialized in it. And I was talking to Alex because he wants to study how to make Ensure Yulu green tea. And he's like, and so he could study that and get like a certification that says, he's a maker of this tea, but it's only specifically for Ensure Yulu green tea. Like it's not a universal, I know, now I can make green tea. It's, if you want to make Dragon Well green tea, you have to do another certification. If you want to make Tong Muguan, Zhengshan Xiaozhong, you have to go there and you have to study it. And so I have a tea master here in Jiangsu, and he just created the city's first red tea, the first black tea. This area in the 90s started doing this green tea called Luyang Chun. And Luyang Chun is this, how would I describe it? It's kind of like a needle-shaped green tea that kind of looks like an Anji Bai Cha, but it tastes a little more like Mao Fong or sparrow's tongue. It's very, very vegetal, a little spicy, some green peppers in it, but it's like of that needle shape. And so that's the only tea that's around here. But my tea master was wanting to, do something novel, do something unique. And so he went to the Wuyi Mountains, he went to Tongmuguan, he studied how they're making red tea there, and he took that information, he got a certification, he has a plaque and everything. And he brought it back to Yangzhou, and he started making the first red tea here. And so this kind of goes to show you that even though he's been drinking black tea, red tea for, the past 40 years, even though he knows how to taste it, he knows how to assess quality, he still doesn't know how to make it. He has to go study how to make it. And so even for a tea master, there's still things that you can learn. There's still things that you need to understand. And so for me, somebody who's looking in from the outside at all of these tea-making processes, and I'm trying to piece together my reality from these, left-brain small little bits of information, and I'm trying to perceive the greater whole, there's going to be struggle. There's going to be frustration. There's going to be conflict between what I think is right and what is right. And I just have to be aware of that, and I have to be open to growth. And I really think that this experience that I just had, where I was misusing a term, and I was able to go back on it and be like, yep, I was misusing that term. Thank you for the correction. I think that's the right mentality to have. And I really hope that, more people can have these kinds of communications, can be more open-minded in the tea world as they're learning about tea, as we're progressing on this journey of understanding. And the beauty of this mindset is that it can go both ways. Maybe you have valuable information that other people don't. And I probably have valuable information that other people don't. And if we have this growth mind, this growth-oriented mind, and we kind of do away with some of our pride, then it doesn't matter what kind of information we share as long as we're all deepening our understanding. And I think somebody talked to me about the specific chemistry that's going on with old growth trees and the roots reaching down into the clay soils and the lack of oxygen there requiring the trees to expend more energy and they get more nutrients, and that's what creates this old bush taste. I wonder if my tea farmers know that. I think they intuitively know that, but they don't know chemically why it is. And so this kind of gets into, in the Western world, science has advanced quite a bit past the mountains of China. Science is a relatively modern invention, speaking of the tea world and humanity itself, just a couple hundred years old. And so what we're doing is we're taking that, we're putting it back on the world. And the goal here is to develop a higher quality of tea, to develop a deeper understanding of why things are the way they are. And that is also fantastic, but it is very different from how tea is perceived in China. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of every episode, this podcast is about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. It's not necessarily about the deep dive into the scientific processes of these teas, because I'm not an expert in that. All my experience comes from living in China, talking with farmers, buying and selling tea. And so even if I will do a little dip into why certain teas happen this way, why certain teas age, which I do want to do a whole episode on white teas and how they age and why they age. But my main focus is sharing my understanding, my stories of the farmers, of how they're making tea, of what they think of the tea. And I remember I reached out to my master Zhang, who makes that white tea, and I kind of asked him what's going on, and he's using these Chinese words well beyond my level. And he talks about, I think it's the protein hydrolysis that happens when you're withering a tea. And it's really important to control that in a very specific way, because that is what can cause these off flavors of a poorly made tea, poorly made white tea. But again, this is well beyond my level of understanding, even in English. And so trying to learn this from Chinese from a tea master is still going to take a lot of effort on my part. And so kind of getting back to it, the whole reason for making this episode is kind of maybe a justification of the podcast and an explanation of how we do One River Tea is the fact that we are going to talk about tea and explain what we know or what we think we know. And I think that's the main difference is, we have been living here for a long time. We've been studying tea. We've been going to all these mountains, but we're still not experts on it. We're still learning. We're in that learning process. And so it's worth it to spread this information, to talk about it, to create, this foundation where we can grow from, where we can talk about and meet on. And so I will kind of continue to do this, and maybe I might have to redact some things in the future episodes because, I might learn more next year than I know now, especially if we talk about aging white teas. Like if I make this episode and then in 2 months I go to Fuding and I start talking to Cho and talking to Zhang and talking to Ju and talking to Wu all about the different processes, I might have to come back and make a whole new episode on what exactly brown Chomei is and what exactly aged white tea is and why it ages and stuff. So if you're listening to this, just thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much for all the kind feedback. But then also realize that this is not 100% factual. This is me sharing my knowledge, and it could be wrong. And so don't worry about challenging it. Though please don't send me emails about every single mistake I make. That would crush me. But I mean, if it's pretty jarring and stuff like that, I would love to learn, but in moderation, please. Yeah, getting back into kind of how we're doing everything and how we're drinking tea, how we're tasting it, how we're all progressing in our journey. I think somebody mentioned it's okay to drink bad teas because drinking bad teas is how you grow your understanding of what good teas are. And so, taste all the teas you can, drink as much as you can, and then eventually you'll find what works for you. And it's highly subjective. What works for you, your favorite tea, might be a tea that somebody hates, right? And so it's really important to develop your own taste, your own tongue, and don't be afraid what other people think. I mean, unless that's your thing, unless you're really just drinking tea for the tea forums and you're really focused on drinking tea that other people think is good. But I just get so upset when I take a tea to, even my tea master, and he opens up the bag, he looks at it, looks at the leaves, smells it, and he's like, this isn't good tea. And then he won't even drink it. And I'm like, how can you say it's not good tea if you haven't even tried it? And so, again, this is just a plea to be open-minded about everything that's happening in the tea world and to accept criticism, and don't be afraid to challenge some things that seem like truth, but then also don't die on any hills out there. Speaking of dying on hills, there's this really hot talk about crushing tea leaves in the Gongfu tea session in Chaozhou, and I have never ever seen it. I lived in Chaozhou for a year, and I, met with everyone from the tea makers to the tea drinkers to the tea sellers to the teapot makers, and I asked literally everyone, and they've never heard about it. They say, no, you're not supposed to crush it. And when I say it, they look at me like I'm kind of a crazy foreigner. They're like, that's not how you drink tea. And I think that what they're thinking of, they assume I'm trying to make it like bagged tea, like crushed tea bags. I'm like, no, that's for tea bags. I'm like, no, you put it in the pot and you crush a little bit of it, like 30%, then you put the rest in it. And they're like, maybe if it's really bad tea. And nobody that I've talked to so far has any idea about it. And I've talked to, the older generation, the newer generation, people that don't speak any Mandarin. I've talked to them in that local Chaoshan dialect through friends, and they still have no idea what I'm talking about. So speaking of hills that, you don't want to die on, that's one that I'm not going to die on. That's just me sharing my own experience that I've never seen it happen. And so if this is one where if you have proof of it happening, if you have evidence of it from original sources, from people talking about it, people doing it and stuff like that, don't be afraid to share it with me, because it's something that I could then share to my friends in Chaozhou and see if they've heard about it, because maybe it's just we're talking around each other and they don't know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyways, This was a rather interesting episode of Tea Soup, so if you're still here, thank you for sticking around for it. And I do promise to get back into white tea next time. And so until then, this is Derek from One Over Tea, urging you all to keep an open mind. And until next time, brew happy.